Well, welcome everybody to day 2, session 2B about SFL and education. We have 3 wonderful presentations lined up here. First from Maria Brisk, Tracy Hodgson Drysdale, and Liz McDonald. And then second, we'll be hearing from Anne McCabe and Ana Linares, and third from Joanna Pitura. I'll turn the floor over to our presenters here, and we'll have about 20 minutes of presentation and 10 minutes or more of discussion, since we have just 3 presentations in this 2-hour block. My name is Catherine Acurso, and I'm so happy to be welcoming you to the first ever online SFLIG conference. Although for many of you, this is the second online SFL conference you've had the opportunity to attend in just 2 weeks. And so it's nice to see some of you again already. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first pair of presenters this morning. Welcome.
Let me share the screen and we'll get started. Okay, I'm Maria Brisk at Boston College.
And I'm Liz McDonald, working in the Boston Public Schools and also at Boston College.
And I'm Tracy Hodgson Drysdale, and I'm currently working out of Carleton University in Canada.
Okay, we're going to tell you about how our online courses develop as a way to reach out more people who are interested in learning about the SFL genre pedagogy. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to how the online courses developed. We spent 10 years doing research at an elementary urban school in the Boston area, which was very multilingual. And we brought the theory to the teachers, and together with the teachers, we developed the way to teach children writing using the SFL genre pedagogy. And we developed this slowly. And in order to work with the teachers, I created materials that translated SFL so that teachers could understand. And as a result of that, I ended up putting all that into a book. Because of the success of this particular school that happened to be one of the failing schools, and in about 3 years got to be to level 1, a number of the schools asked us to bring the professional development to their schools. So we were running around like crazy, going from school to school and trying trying to prepare teachers to do this work. And it got to be too much. So the idea was, how about trying to do it online? So after a whole year of figuring out what online meant and trying to translate it and telling the techies BC what to do, because they hadn't been very involved in that yet. This was over 5 years, about 6 or 7 years ago. We came up with 3 4-week long, 1 graduate credit online courses. One of the things that happened also helped our development was that the elementary school became a showcase. So a number of people who were taking the courses or were reaching us that were interested started visiting the school. So they were constantly visited. And it was interesting, one department head that had middle and high school teachers took to visit this elementary school And she said it really inspired our middle school and high school teachers, because we were like, gosh, if they can write that way, our students can really grow quickly too. So the courses we developed were the way we decided to divide the content was sort of translating the Common Core text types into SFL genres. So that's what felt natural for the courses. So for narrative, we included, like personal recount, all of the historical genres, and then fictional narratives. And for the second course, we took the informational explanatory text type and translated into reports and all forms of explanations. And then the informational explanatory barely mentions procedures. So this procedures is really the stepchild of the Common Core. So I decided to put it together with all forms of argumentation. So that makes the third course, and anybody can take any of these courses at any time. They don't depend one from the other. Now, one of the values of the courses is that they have a strong basis on theory. So the what of teaching writing is based on SFL, the notion of genre, and particularly what we call language, which is really the metafunctions of the register. And this part of teaching language includes using precise or bridge meta-language and focusing on language and learning language for its function. Most of the writing approaches and most of the literacy teaching in the US doesn't have much focus on language. And then this makes a huge difference, especially for bilingual learners. The other important aspect is the how. And so for the how, we follow the teaching and learning cycle that SFLers are pretty familiar with it, but it's really an apprentice approach to learning, where students learn from experts, with experts, and then can function on their own. So all of these added to the SFL language pedagogy, which is at the heart of the content of the course. So one teacher said, really got the notion of function. She said, it's not really useful to say that's a preposition. It's way more useful to say, why would you use that, or why an author use it, and why it benefits a reader. And so that kind of approach to language. So it's a notion that you use the language because it has a function in making meaning. So the important part of SFL, and this is for the SFLers, this is common knowledge, but this shows you how we show the teachers how to think about SFL, is that that the text is the unit of teaching, and this text exists in the context of culture, which determine the genres that you teach, and also in the context of situation that tells you what language resources the students need, because the content demands it, the audience and the voice demands it, and the need for writing in a cohesive way. So that's how we show the teachers about SFL. And then the teaching and learning cycle, over the 10 years of working with teachers, we have modified it a little bit. So we do start with the deconstruction of text and then go into joint planning. And we tend to use graphic organizers for the planning, and then the joint construction. And from the joint construction, you can publish. So the students, and we have students of all ages publishing together. Usually for older students, we use it as the first project, commonly written, published. And then you can have individual or group. We have the students working a lot in groups. Even if they're writing individually, they help each other all the time, especially because we have multilingual students that they can support each other. The other aspect that we introduced in the cycle is the notion of joint revision. So you take a material from students' work and together as a class look over it and zero in a few things that they have learned over the unit to revise. So we show them how to revise before they revise individually in groups, and then another opportunity to publish. And all of this is set in the context of learning content. So all the writing is done within content areas: science, language arts, social studies, particularly. So with these two things gave us the content, but then we reviewed the literature to see, so what makes a good online course, and then decided to design the course using some of the advice of the literature. And this is what one of the teachers said when she was interviewed about how they thought the instruction that we were sharing in the course was different. And she said the writing that we did before was always some sort of a prompt at the end of each unit based on the book we read. I don't think it was really teaching writing. It was analyzing literature. I mean, which I think it's important as well, but we weren't actually teaching them how to write. And a lot of the teachers didn't like it, but couldn't articulate why they didn't like it. And that is true. So much of the teaching of writing is one last week at the end of the reading unit in which you do something in response to the text that you've just written. And that really doesn't prepare students to do original writing. So that was a very important aspect of what we were teaching. So now we're going to give you a little bit more of a description of what goes into the courses. And then Tracy is going to share the analysis that she did on best practices for online courses and how that is reflected in our courses. Liz?
As Dr. Brish shared, there are 3 courses. They can be uncoupled, so they can be taken just on their own. But each of the 3 courses is designed with the same 3 major components, which includes the content, which is asynchronous, assignments, which are both, there are individual assignments, and there's also opportunities for educators to work collaboratively on assignments. And then finally, the live sessions or the Zoom meetings, which are the synchronous sessions. So I'm going to talk a little more in depth about what the asynchronous modules or content looks like. Everything is organized on Canvas, the course site. And I will add here that it's very user-friendly. And so the teachers or the educators are able to go through each module fairly easily. Dr. Brisk, if you click to the next slide, I'll talk about what is in each of those 5 modules. The first one being an introduction to the course, and then each subsequent one being designed around the theory of either looking at purpose, stages, or language of the particular genre being studied, or the particular genres being studied in that course. So the asynchronous content includes lectures, which once again aligns to either purpose, stages, or language. There are also activities for educators to participate in, such as looking at student work sessions. There are videos of teachers in action teaching lessons. There's also videos of interviews of teachers, and you'll hear their perspective on the theory or the implementation through the teaching and learning cycle. There's readings that align to the content of the modules, both from Dr. Brisk's book, but also additional readings of situations where Dr. Brisk or Tracy or other researchers have worked with educators in the field. Teachers particularly like those readings because they get to see the theory in action. And then also there are materials in the asynchronous content in Spanish, which has been very beneficial for the dual language schools that we've been working with particularly. The piece of the course on the next slide that I would say gets the rave reviews of educators is the major assignment, which is a unit. And what educators like about this assignment is that they can take it and they can turn around and implement it right away in their classroom or with the students with whom they're working. The benefits of this there are benefits for both the educators and the instructor, in that the major assignment, this unit plan, is cumulative. So each week, as the educators are learning the theory and the teaching and learning, the SFL theory and the teaching and learning cycle more in depth, they are adding to their unit. From the instructor side, the instructor is giving weekly feedback, which is fantastic because it alleviates going too far with too many misconceptions. And then at the end, the teachers have a strong roadmap to take into their classroom and use. You can see one of the quotes down below of a teacher that shared how much they enjoyed the assignment, but also the opportunity to collaborate with others. Right before this session, I was giving feedback to a team of 3rd grade teachers who I'm working with a course right now. And the email heading said, help, we need help with the unit plan. So right away, we're able to give them feedback. They're just on the proposal, but they're stuck of whether it's the appropriate genre and the appropriate task. And then that leads us to the synchronous session, which is the 3rd piece of the courses. So if we go here and talk about the synchronous sessions, Tracy, I think you and I've talked a lot about this, where at first the participants are confused because they think it's a traditional synchronous session in which the instructor is going to give a lecture or do some explicit teaching. It is an opportunity for the instructor to frame the upcoming content or to review the previous content, but really the crux of this time is an opportunity for the participants to share with each other. So just yesterday during a synchronous session that I was running, and I know that Dr. Brisk and Tracy do the exact same thing, you look at the assignment wherever they are in their unit. I was able to highlight elements of the units that had been handed in. And then during the synchronous session, participants were able to share those highlighted elements of their unit, which were highlighted either because they were exemplary and or because they were exemplary and an element that the instructor, myself, had seen as an area needing clarification. So what happens during those synchronous sessions is the participants become the teachers through the work that they're doing. Tracy is now going to share with us how the organization and the creation of these courses is both reflective of the research on online learning and then also what was found through these particular online courses.
Thanks, Liz. So we're going to look at the online learning protocol, and we have down the left the best practices that we saw in the research. And so there are 4 key things that we really wanted to focus on. And so the first was the learning task itself. Then it was content and learning support, people and social support, and also technology and again, social support. So these were some key things that stood out in the research as being very important to online learning. So if we look back at the learning task, in this particular set of courses, the main task is creating the unit plan. And as Liz showed you, that happens over the weeks of the course. It's sort of an iterative, ongoing process, and it allows the teachers to learn gradually, try out what they're learning, and then build on that. The content and learning support in number 2 is again based on that unit plan building throughout the course, but it's also based on the timely feedback. So just having the teachers create the unit plan would be good, but the content's really challenging. So having the timely feedback is essential. They need to have it each week so that they can ask questions, so that we can help correct any misconceptions. And so that's really a critical part. And I think it's possibly a bit unique to online courses that we all really strive to give that feedback before the next synchronous session. Then there's a balance of individual and group work. So there are some discussions where participants share individually, and there's one individual lesson plan assignment, but that's all still framed within the unit plan within that group work. And most often teachers choose to do the unit plan as a group. They could do it on their own, but it's really beneficial to them if they can do it as a group, especially if they're teachers working in the same school, because then they're collaborating on something, as was said earlier, that they really can just implement either as they're taking the courses or just after they take the courses. So it's really beneficial for them to learn together. And that helps them to continue using SFL in their teaching if they learn it together, because they can support each other. Also in content and learning support, we had the various ways to access the content. And Liz showed you the slide of the asynchronous learning and all the different ways that the content is created in the courses. So it's not just through the book, it's not just through articles, and it's not just through one type of videos, it's even different types of videos to really engage the teachers. If we move on to the people and social support, the synchronous sessions really do help to build community through what we share, but also through what the teachers themselves share. So when they get to teach each other and when they get to ask questions, it really helps to build community. They really love to hear the questions that other people have, but also the successes that they're having and the ideas that they bring to it. And that was true in the original project as well. When the teachers shared, those were really things that we could pick up and see how we could integrate them to make the whole project stronger. There's also, again, the detailed and timely feedback. And I know Maria's had the comment that she gives more feedback and really good feedback than any other instructor on the planet, I believe was the quote. And then if we go to technology and social support, the really clear, consistent course design based on pedagogical theory and SFL really helps the teachers a lot. When they come to the modules, as Liz said earlier, they're designed in a way so that each week the content is set up in a similar way. So they're not trying to find things or figure out how the course works. It's a nice systematic course design, which is really crucial for online learning. And all this happened before we knew globally as much about online learning. So this is now, some of this might seem like, well, of course we do that, but that wasn't the case a few years ago. So do you want to go on to the next slide, Maria? So there were obviously some challenges. Oh, if you want to go to the challenges. And the first one, well, we'll go through the challenges themselves first. So there was the online medium itself. Then there was the content, the structure, and the rigor. So if we look at those sort of peach colored rectangles. So the online medium, as I just said, at the time, people weren't really used to online learning when these courses started. So one teacher said, I'd started the class last year, but I had to drop it because it was a little hard to understand the online format at that point. So that was before the pandemic. And also there were some things that needed to be tweaked in the courses, and Maria worked really hard to go back through and take the feedback from the participants to make things clearer. So it was already good design, but there are always things that we can make better. The second challenge was the content. SFL can be challenging. It's hard when you start out, but when you see the participants get that aha moment where they start to get it, then it's worth it. As we said before, the structure of the courses was a bit challenging because it was different. Teachers typically are used to in-person PD or in-person graduate courses, and this mix of asynchronous and synchronous was a little bit challenging for them at first. And then the rigor, that was also something that was maybe a little unexpected for teachers. Some of them thought they were taking PD or professional development, and really they're taking graduate courses. So even though they're divided up into 3 sections, the content is challenging, and it's meant to be challenging so that the participants get more out of it. So if we go on to the next slide, we have another quote from one of the teachers who said that much of what we're given to teach in public education today is scripted, and investing time in laying out the lessons, objectives, and activities first helped me to engage in the curriculum and to write lesson plans. It also gave me ownership of the work I was creating. Now, the ownership, I think, is key in all of this. The teachers really feel like they're not learning something that's just an add-on. It's not something that's prescriptive. It's something that they can really understand and work with and develop in a way that suits their own teaching style and suits their own interests in teaching or their philosophy for teaching. So I think that helps it to have longevity because they really buy into it because of that ownership component. And if you think about change theory, change really takes time, it takes support, and it takes commitment. And if what the teachers are doing is meaningful, then they're going to be able to invest the time and to try and find the support and to be committed to it. And the way the courses are set up, they also help the teachers, if they take all 3, they do have time to develop their knowledge of SFL and to begin to understand it in different ways. And we see a big difference between teachers taking the first course, whichever one they take first, the second one, and then when they're taking the third course, they understand the theory so much better and they're so much more engaged. So they do get time to learn it. They do get support throughout the courses from us and from each other. And there is commitment. And if people email us after the fact, we're still always ready to help, even if the course happened a year ago. We just want the teachers to learn and be able to use it. So the goal of the teachers is to make teachers knowledgeable of an approach to teaching that's really based on support and supported through positive experiences of the other schools. So we want them to be able to implement these to be best practices, but we don't want it to be a recipe. We want it to be their own so that it's as useful as it can possibly be for them. And the courses continue to evolve. So each time we get new groups of teachers, like the dual language teachers, the Spanish element was added. We've recently worked with groups of science coaches and teachers, and that modifies it a little bit. And we hope to be able to keep on doing this for years to come. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether we have some time for questions. Catherine said that one speaker had dropped out, so there is a little bit more time for our session.
Yes, that's exactly right. We have about 15 minutes available for questions or discussion, and perhaps I'll just kick that off by reading out a comment that came through in the chat. Jennifer Walshmar, who's here in Vancouver, where I am today, pointed out that there was an interesting distinction there you made between graduate coursework and professional development. And I wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit more on that and what kind of mindset difference or framing you have to do with that in mind.
Well, that's probably one of the hardest things that we deal with. But through supporting and encouraging the participants, they begin to realize that they have to do work to that level. And once in a while, a couple of people just drop out because they just can't handle we are having less and less of that experience. I don't know whether you guys want to add something.
Well, one thing we're doing that the course, Tracy said the courses are evolving. And one thing we've been doing more recently is when we have a school or a school district participating, be in the initial stages of figuring out who's going to take the course and, you know, what grade level bands or so forth, we start to talk to the leaders of the school or the school district about the time that the participants may need to complete the work. And so more recently, schools, individual schools are building that time in. That would be their professional learning time to work with the graduate course. So that's been very successful so far as we go forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other question? Let's see. I haven't checked.
I'll ask a question perhaps while we wait for any other folks in the audience to share. I had two questions actually, and one of them is about who has access to the course. Is it just practicing teachers who are in Boston Public Schools who have access to it now, or are you using these also for maybe teachers working on an MEd or an MAT or something like this? And then the second question, and maybe they can be related to each other, I don't know, is more broad. Do you have any comments about the need or the nature of sustained support of this type for teachers? I mean, you talked about how important that weekly feedback was, but part of the beauty of the initial long-term project was the sustained connection you had between folks at the university and folks in the school district. And I wondered how you are kind of attending to that sustained piece through this initiative.
Well, the courses are open to anybody who wants to take them. Our goal, and Liz has been great working on that, is to get whole schools, because you can't teach writing just by teaching second grade and nothing else, or seventh grade and nothing else. So the goal is to get whole schools involved. But you know, anybody can take it, and we do have that. We do have a lot of that. We must have over 25 schools right now that have participated, and they can be from anywhere. The sustainability, Liz has been very good at working with schools after, because she's embedded in the system in terms of Boston. But the other thing that we do is that we get principals and literacy coaches and leaders also take the course, so that they understand that there has to be an in-house leadership towards that. And as Liz mentioned, we usually have a meeting with the leaders even before teachers start taking the course, so that they have an understanding of what they're going to get and what it takes to sustain it. No? I don't know whether I answered all your questions. I saw Nigel had something. How do you recruit teachers? Teachers pay for the course? Yeah, we actually recruit by reputation. Right now in Boston, lots of schools want to do this because they've seen what's happened to the schools that have been involved. What we have is we have two prices. One, if you want to get graduate credit, you have to pay the horrendous fees of a private college like BC. But we have what we call a no credit fee, which is reasonable, and the school systems give their own internal credit to the teachers. For instance, our course had to go through a system of approval in the Boston Public Schools so that the teachers could get a credit. So they had to see the content and the assignments and all of that in order to approve it. So I don't know, let's see, Anna, can you explain a bit more how collaborative organized? Yeah, well, the collaboration is that the major assignment, as Lisa explained, is creating a genre unit for a grade level in one of the genres. And so the teachers can work as a team in creating that. And we actually found that the quality of the product is better when it's been the result of a team. I had an interesting experience working with content area middle school teachers, and there was a math teacher that took her 2 courses before she could create a unit that wasn't pure math, that was actually genre and literacy. But what helped is that she worked with one of the colleagues who was a literacy specialist. So I don't know. I've been answering all the questions. I let Tracy, and well, I'm just bossy. What can you do? I let Tracy and Liz say something.
Well, just in regards to like how it was organized, teachers get to choose who they work with. And then, you know, sometimes it's a grade level team, sometimes it's discipline specific. More recently, we've been working with a lot of schools that have sub-separate classrooms that then teachers decide they're in a strand. Are they going to work with their grade level counterpart or on their own, or are they going to work with other teachers in their strand? And people choose to go different ways depending on that relationship or the composition of the school or the students in front of them.
I think that's interesting because in the original research project before the online courses existed, that is kind of what happened in the school that we were initially working in. The teachers collaborated, and sometimes it was science specialists with classroom teachers or reading specialists. And so that element of collaboration was kind of there in the initial project. And it's, I think that's important that it carries through into the online courses, because that really is key. It's that multiple voices and talking about what they don't understand about the theory and what they do understand and how they can apply it in ways that make sense to them. So that's important.
One thing that I didn't say, and I think it's important, the fact that we did 10 years of research is that, you know, we learned a lot, but also we have tons of videos of teachers teaching. And so we've been able to create, you know, 3-minute long clips that we have all over the course to show things. And those are very valuable, I think. But we wouldn't have had it if we hadn't been in a school, embedded in a school for so long. Let's see. Do you have any data pointing to student writing improvement? Well, not in contrast. Most the data that we have comes from the state test, which is a English language art test. So they actually teach reading and writing, but the reading was also being impacted by the improvement of the writing. But the only contrast is that the schools were doing badly before they started working with us, and then they improved as a school. And you know, these are all urban schools. There is one that it's important if it has a good leader, but there's one that in the state testing in writing scores on average higher than the entire state, and these are urban schools. So it has had an impact, and word of mouth among the principals is what really has moved people to want to do it. No?
And then very informally, working with teachers in schools, we'll do some pre and post assessments, you know, before and at the end of teaching a genre. And one of these days, Tracy and Dr. Briss, one of these days, I'll leave the classroom or the schools and do this research like I keep meaning to do. But that's just informal right now. But teachers like that because they can see on a pre-post assessment the areas of the genre that the students have clearly made progress in.
I have one other question also, because I know some folks in the audience here work with pre-service teachers, whereas your project involves a lot of in-service teachers. And I wonder if you had any experiences or thoughts about how you might shift or reframe this, working with pre-service teachers who maybe don't have like their particular class of students in mind, the same way that your participants do. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on how you might change things for pre-service versus in-service?
I was teaching pre-service teachers live before, and it took me one semester to decide that I couldn't teach the course unless they were in the field. So I paired it with a required field semester. So they would do 8 weeks of teaching, like a mini unit in the classroom. So if I were to do it online with pre-service teachers, I would require that too. I mean, they have no clue what you're talking about unless they have the experience of being with the kids. And actually, I think they learned a lot more from being with the kids than anything I told them, you know. And the feedback that I gave them as a result of being with the kids, it's just central. You just can't do it without doing that. At least I think that. I don't know.
Yeah, there's one more question here in the chat, and just Maria, that answer resonates with me in my work with pre-service teachers too. It works when they're with children also. But Joanna is asking, and maybe this will be our last question, can you say a little bit more about what aspects of SFL you introduced to the teacher participants?
Well, as Liz was mentioning, we first focus on the purpose of the genres, because if the purpose is not clear, everything goes down the drain. And then the stages of the particular genres, and how a text is divided in or flows in the stages, and how you teach each one of those stages. And then we work a lot on the language. I've always done the language last because it's the one that scares the most everybody. And when I mean language, I mean the language that you need to express the feel and the tenor and the mode. But then when they plan the units, they have to teach purpose and stages and language parallel. Because I learned from the teachers at the school that I worked that if you don't start with the language from day one, there's no way the kids get it, because it's the most challenging thing, especially the schools we work that are highly multilingual. So that the other thing that I've done, and I was actually in a conversation with Sally Humphrey from Australia yesterday, and that is that I've chosen the aspects of language that are key to a genre to focus first and intensely, and then you can focus on others. So for instance, in report and explanations, you have to focus on noun groups. All of the information of a report, for instance, is in these very complex noun groups with adjectives and embedded clauses and prepositional phrases. And, I've analyzed text for fourth graders, and the noun groups are 20 words long, So if they don't do anything else, if they do noun groups, the kids are going to be way ahead. In any narrative genre, you have to focus on the verb groups, because the verb groups and a variety of verb types, because they give the quality of the people you're writing about. And then in argumentation, you have to do appraisal, you have to do evaluative language, you have to do graduation, the things that show perspective of the author. So again, initially we started when and that's again the value of having worked in that school, done research in the school. Initially, we were going to work on all aspects of language for each genre, and then the teachers told me I was crazy, and so I followed their advice. And so we decided, I just did a chart. What are all the aspects of language we need to teach? What can we teach in each genre? And so as a composite, the kids get all of the aspects of language, but not in each unit that they become overwhelmed, the teachers and the kids. No, so sorry for the long answer.
Well, thank you so much. Everyone, please join me in thanking our first presenters here with your reaction button. We're going to turn now to our second set of presenters. The floor is yours. You should be able to share your screen, Anne and Anna.
Thank you, Catherine. Anna will be sharing the screen. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to our session. We're going to be looking at a very different kind of context. Anna, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So we're looking at a content and language integrated learning experience. And so, I mean, obviously, how can we characterize CLIL is one of our questions, and SFL, I think we would all agree, is a big key to answering that question. And then how can we use the research that we do in looking at CLIL classes in CLIL teacher education? And you can see on the slide that this is the work over many years at the University Autónoma de Madrid. And you also have there the UAM CLIL website in case you'd like to know more about what we're doing, publications, the projects we've been involved in, etc. So on the next slide, we can see the research context, and this is the Madrid bilingual program. So in Madrid, Spain, since 2004, there's been a bilingual public education schools program. And in that program, children are taught in primary school through a foreign language. And so this is part of the push for plurilingualism in the European Union. And so students may be taught subjects through a foreign language such as French, German, and the biggest one, as you can see on the slide, is students are taught subjects through English. So, we've collected data over a period of time. So the end of primary school, which ends at grade 6, when children are 11, 12 years old, and secondary school ends at grade 10. So when they're 15, 16 years old, and then they can go on to do 2 final years that prepare them for the university. But we collected data in the project over these years. And you can see the kinds of data we've been able to collect on the slide. Today, we're going to be talking mostly about the written, not all of the data, some subsets of the written and the spoken data. So on the next slide, we can, okay, now we've just been listening to a wonderful presentation on, a genre-based approach to SFL. And, I think that a lot of us have seen all of the wonderful work, including that led by Dr. Brisk and others, working with genres and then, thinking about the lexico-grammatical needs as we just heard, of those genres, but we're working on something different. So on the next slide, we can see that we're looking at the lexical grammar of key uses of academic language, or what are also called cognitive discourse functions. And so our project has been looking at these, and on the next slide, we can see what the cognitive discourse functions are. These were theorized by Christiane Dalton-Puffer, and she, went through numerous nomenclatures, taxonomies in the field of education. And she came up with these broad categories of cognitive discourse functions. And so, you know, we've been looking at these, and sorry, yes, you can go on. So the chat came up. Okay, and so, you know, one of our big questions in the CLIL project is which of these are realized when, how much, by whom, and a key question, how are they realized in terms of lexical grammar? So how do we collect written and spoken data for analysis? Well, we used written prompts and spoken prompts. Sometimes students were paired and they did interviews of each other. And you can see that the prompts elicit or target each of the different CDFs, okay? So that's how we collected data, and then we analyzed it on the next slide by breaking up into pairs, and each pair had one of the CDFs, and we went through the written and spoken data from the classroom. I did forget to mention that there was no specific intervention. Okay, so we just wanted to see what these kids could do after being taught subject material through a foreign language, through English. So we broke up. On the next slide, you can see an example of the use of Mick O'Donnell's corpus tool, you know, where you can code the data and then evaluate it, or excuse me, code it using the coding system. So we're going to go on to look at results from just two of the cognitive discourse functions, evaluate and define, and this is work that we've been doing. I've been working on Evaluate with Rachel Whitaker, which has been a treat. And Anna has been working with Nashat Sovi on definitions. And so we're going to look at those two in this talk today. So on the next slide, so evaluate, a couple of our research questions, you know, are there differences over time in evaluating history? Again, no teaching, but we wanted to see level of maturity, level of exposure through studying the subject in English. And we have another question, do they develop discipline appropriate couplings, which I'll be explaining in a minute. So on the next slide, we can see that, of course, we use the appraisal framework to analyze the students' you know, when they evaluated something in a text, were they using appreciation, judgment, or affect? And on the next slide, we can see also that a key part of evaluating is making judgment based on criteria and standards. And Caroline Coffin wrote about the difficulty that students had in justifying their evaluations. And so this led us to thinking about coupling, you know, that Jim Martin and Teresa Oteiza have written about. And that's coupling of resources from the interpersonal metafunction, so appraisal, with resources from the experiential metafunction, using disciplinary knowledge to justify their evaluations. And on the next slide, you can see a couple of examples. Well, in the first example, we see, you know, a felicitous coupling. So we have they were asked the question, was it better to be a patrician or plebeian? And the student is using the knowledge that he's learned about history to justify his evaluation. But, and this was in year 8, but, you know, we can see from the other two examples that not all of the students could do this. So, you know, I think it's much better to be a plebeian because they were the best. So attitude with attitude. And the second one, the student is using, I would have a lot of free time. So using his everyday knowledge in the 21st century rather than historical knowledge. And so if we go on to the next slide. So we added justifications. So, you know, we looked at, there were bare appreciations, or did the students also justify their evaluations? Okay, so on the next slide, I think we're just going to see a few results. Oh, sorry, yes, I forgot. So this was the text of the prompt in year 10, for example. So, you know, just focusing on evaluation, did the French Revolution improve the role of women? Why or why not? On the next slide, we can see on the left-hand side, the prompt from year 6, name a very important person or invention from the time they were looking at, discovery of America, French Revolution. And then, as I said, in year 8, we've already seen that question. So on the next slide, this is the specific data that we looked at. We were able to follow 11 students who wrote the first year in English. In year 6, some students wrote in English, some students wrote in Spanish. So it's 2 different sets of students, but we followed them through over 4 years of education. So we have this longitudinal research that we can report at. And one thing you can see on this slide is that students did write more in Spanish. And I'll say something very briefly about that as now we look at the results on the next slide. So what we found in doing our analysis, that there were differences. By year 10, that these specific students, you know, writing about history in English with no intervention, they did show an increase in the number and the type of evaluative meanings. So they used far more appreciation, which we know has been written about as seemingly more objective. So rather than using affect, using appreciation, and they would justify their appreciations more frequently in year 10. They also used a greater range of linguistic resources to encode appreciation. We did not find clausal or nominal appreciation in year 6. By year 10, yes, they're writing about social inequality, equality, evolution, etc. They don't always get the spelling right, but they are using these more complex abstract nominal groups. They also moved away from writing about personal affect and into other affect. So, you know, writing about a huge discontent among the population. They also did provide more couplings that demonstrate more historical evidence. I'd need the qualitative data to show you that difference. We just don't have time. But there were more, you know, we saw an increase in the number of students who included that kind of historical evidence. And a really interesting finding, despite having studied history in English in primary and secondary school, they used a wide range of expressions to include attitudinal meanings in Spanish. And that's an important finding because there is a worry among some parents, a myth, that their kids are not going to learn subject matter in Spanish. But our findings are showing, you know what, they can transfer their knowledge. So Anna is now going to go on to talk about define and then about work with teachers.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, so now we move on to the second cognitive discourse function, where we wanted to show some results from, and this is define. And well, in Anne's presentation, when she referred to our analysis of evaluate, she presented these interesting results of longitudinal data, okay, with the same students throughout different school years, from the end of primary education, grade 6, to the end of compulsory secondary education. In this CDF, in the case of define, we wanted to share with you other studies that we carried out, where in this case, well, also this is something that also Anne referred to, the comparison across languages. As Anne mentioned, these students were studying these disciplines in English, but for most of them, their first language was Spanish. So we wanted to see how they were able to express this knowledge in the first language, but you know, in the first language, but in a language that they haven't really used to study this specific content. And here we moved to another field of study, which is biology, and specifically the topic of ecosystems. And another variable that we were interested in was to compare students' performance when they were writing about the topic and when they were speaking about it. Okay, so we are looking at this variable of in this particular study of language and also the mode. So let me see, because this is not reacting now. Okay, so the unit was, this specific unit that we focused on for the analysis of definitions was ecosystems. And that was a topic that they were studying in grade 6. So in this particular case, we were focusing on the last year of primary education. And the students were asked to both write and respond to a prompt where they had to write in response to different CDFs that were elicited in the prompt. In this particular case, we're going to focus on definitions, but the block entry for the students' written production started like this. Students were asked to define ecosystem among other tasks. Okay, so they were asked to define the term, and they were also asked to describe a trip, and they were also asked to explore about, you know, what would happen if certain animals suddenly were placed in a different ecosystem. So they were prompted to respond to different cognitive discourse functions. But in particular, they were expected to define what an ecosystem is. And then they were also asked to do the same orally in interviews that were carried out between us, researchers, and a pair of students, where they were really prompted to do the same as they had done previously in writing, but orally. And here they had to sort of put themselves in a situation where they participated in a radio show, and they were, you know, they had to explain, you know, the audience what, you know, different things about the topic of ecosystems, among other things, define what an ecosystem is. So this is the data that all this specific data set comes from a primary from a grade 6 in primary. There were 3 groups, so we really we were lucky to be able to you know, to obtain this data from all the groups in grade 6 in that particular school. And we asked 2 groups to write about the topic of ecosystem in English, and they also responded orally to the same prompt in English. And the other group, they were asked to do the same in Spanish, so, because we wanted to really focus on their performance in both languages. In this case, English and Spanish, they're different groups, but the same group produced those cognitive discourse functions orally and in writing. So we, of course, needed to sort of find a framework for the analysis of definitions. And we, in this case, draw on Trimble's distinction between formal and semi-formal definitions. And then we also used, of course, systemic functional linguistics for the analysis of the components of definitions. So in terms of the type of definition, we distinguish those definitions that students wrote and used orally as well, where they included a class, so they would be classified as formal, versus those definitions that did not include a class. And you have examples there of the first type. An ecosystem is a community. A community would be the class, and then there, of course, following different elements that could include, well, different characteristics, including processes, attributive relational processes, and also expansions. And we also classified the types of expansions. In a semi-formal definition, we could find, of course, these expansions as well, and various characteristics of related to the term an ecosystem, but the class was missing. This is just to give you an idea of what this network that we used for the analysis looks like. We used Mick O'Donnell's corpus tool. And here at the bottom, you can see the classification of definitions into different types. And at the top, you can see the components where we, of course, identify the term, specifying features, including identifier or attribute and different types of identifiers or attributes. And then we were particularly interested in this, in whether the definitions contained expansions. And we also identified different types of expansions. And we classified them into types of expansions as elaborations, enhancement, and extension. So we used this, we developed this framework, which was data-driven, but then, of course, we also used it for the analysis of all the definitions that the students wrote and used orally. So a summary of the findings, we found that there were little difference across languages. So those students that used formal definitions also used formal definitions. Used formal definitions in English. They also used formal definitions in Spanish. Those that used semi-formal definitions in English tended to use also semi-formal definitions in Spanish. The use of expansions and so on. So there were very few differences across languages, but there were differences across modes, and that was really interesting because we found, for example, in English, that there were more formal definitions in written texts, which makes sense in the sense, or could be expected in the sense that they had more time to write compared to when they had to speak about these terms, where they had less time, and there were more cases of semi-formal definitions where the students did not use the class. But we were also interested in, in contrast, although they use more formal canonical definitions in writing, they use more expansions in their spoken performance. And this could also sort of be an interesting sort of signal of how much the students knew about the term. So in their oral definitions, they said more. They said more about the specific term that they were defining. So here the question is, what is better? Okay, so that they are able to define canonically, and they did that in writing, or that they add more information that can show that they know what they are talking about. In any case, different modes seem to trigger different ways of defining. And as I said, as we said in Spanish, there are similar tendencies. So then the next step after doing this analysis of students' realizations of these cognitive discourse functions, and we just gave an example, you just gave 2 examples, evaluate and define. We then wanted to share this work with the teachers, with content teachers, so teachers of biology, teachers of history, also English teachers, teachers of English, right? So language teachers and content teachers, because one problematic issue in any educational context, but also in content and language integrated learning context or in bilingual education, is assessment. So how do content and language teachers assess students' evaluations and definitions? So, and this is a very problematic issue, and content teachers wonder, whether they should be also assessing language, and sometimes the idea of what assessing language means is really, formal features of a language, and of course they don't feel that they are specialists to do that, right? So how do content and language teachers assess these cognitive discourse functions, students' production of these cognitive discourse functions? And then we wanted to see, whether they would share criteria, and how could we come to a possible integrated approach, content and language integrated approach in the assessment of these texts, or these students' texts, and how the students' perceptions would relate to our own analysis of these CDFs. So, of course, we started thinking when we planned this, subsequent to this previous analysis that we've just shown, we planned these seminars with teachers. We were thinking of a possibility of maybe working with rubrics, and so that teachers work together, content teachers and language teachers. Well, first of all, content teachers of a same field, and then content teachers with language teachers, Well, as we know, rubrics or any assessment tool is problematic. And so what happens is that sometimes, it is difficult to see whether, what we understand from what the students have expressed. Do we all understand the same? Do we all consider or have the same criteria in what is the best text or better text? Also, we ourselves individually don't assess in the same way all the time, right? So sometimes, these are questions that we can maybe all of us identify with. What did I do last time I saw that answer? I'm not sure whether I marked it correctly or not. Or, oof, I'm tired, I'll leave the rest till tomorrow. And then tomorrow maybe we use other criteria. Or, oh my God, these students are getting worse and worse. So we came across this type of analysis, which is called comparative judgment, and we use this tool, which is called normal marking, where the idea is that two responses on the same prompt by two different students appear on the screen, and then the teacher or the person who is assessing those texts chooses the best response, and then two other texts come up on the screen. So you're constantly, or teachers would be constantly comparing responses from students with many different responses, right? And then what happens at the end is that there is a ranking of responses based on many comparisons by many markers, many teachers marking. So we use this tool. We ask the content teachers and language teachers to assess students' definitions, students' evaluations, students' descriptions, etc., using comparative judgment. And then, so we had these different groups of teachers: English teachers, science teachers, history teachers, science teachers and history teachers teaching both in English and in Spanish. And so we were really using here in these seminars with teachers a multidisciplinary approach, because each teacher was assessing the students' text from their own perspective, right? So they had to just holistically decide which text was better. So we had a ranking, and this is an example of a ranking of definitions of ecosystem, what an ecosystem is. And here at the top, you see 0 means that this definition did not get and was not chosen as the best answer by any of the teachers, any of the markers. And 100 means that in all cases, this definition was considered better than any other definition. So that gave us, researchers, the possibility of looking, of sort of matching these results with our own analysis of definitions. And for example, we saw that this one that was the lowest rated was not structured as a definition. It didn't have a class. So obviously those definitions that are not non-formal were rated low. In this case, they're structured a definition as definitions, but there was no class again, and there were no abstractions. These are the second and the third definition. And then the 3 higher rated, the ones that were rated 72, 72, and 72 contained abstractions, contained generalizations, and expansion, additional scientific information. And then the one that was the highest rated was a very canonical definition, the kind of definition that you would expect from a textbook. So we use this as a point for discussion, because of course this is the overall results, but different teachers were doing different things, and different teachers were ranking, especially the ones in the middle. Of course, they may have been ranked differently by different teachers. So then we used focus groups where content and language teachers discuss the results of their assessment, and then all of us, researchers, content teachers, and language teachers, run discussions together. And here we were moving from a multidisciplinary to an interdisciplinary approach, because here really we wanted to get this context where there could be a mutual understanding, and whether there could be a meta language that could be sort of understood by different teachers. And these are the kind of things that were said in the focus group, content teacher, for example, would say, ecosystem is not only living things, so obviously, as expected, referring to the content. But a content teacher would also say something like, because of a language, because this was rated the lowest because of a language, and I think it's got nothing to do with what an ecosystem is. So here, the teacher is combining a comment on content, nothing to do with what an ecosystem is, with a comment on language, because of a language. So the content teacher is acknowledging that this should be rated, or has been rated, very low because of the language. And then the language teacher referred to content, so this is rated not so high, or because of how content is organized, or here in this case, she was referring to the highest rated by saying there are spelling mistakes, but I wouldn't mark it lower. So this is a language teacher putting a content hat, putting on a content hat, and the content teacher at some points also referring to language issues. So these are other examples. Content teachers saying, referring to this definition, an ecosystem is like a food chain, and saying is terrible. Okay, so referring to the language that is used, or a language teacher referring to this definition, an ecosystem is a community formed of a habitat, etc. For me, it is the best definition, I guess, because of the content. So they were really somehow sharing or exchanging their expertise and sharing approaches that maybe they wouldn't have had before. So this is an example of interdisciplinary work. And then finally, the next step was for content and language teachers to design tasks together. And that is what we consider a transdisciplinary approach, because they generate a new product, a new task together, right? Which is integrated, which is content and language integrated. So here, for example, this is an example of what a chemistry teacher and an English teacher designed, okay, on the topic of a periodic table, identifying language resources that would be necessary for the expression of the different cognitive discourse functions, and then working with the students on those, and then eliciting students' texts, such as this one. The periodic table is a tabular display of chemical elements. These elements, okay, so their errors are pure substances consisting only of atoms that all have the same number of protons in their atomic nucleus. And I chose the marvelous zinc element because I had to choose an element from the periodic table. So comments again from a language teacher, marvelous. I can see the student's effort to use adjectives, or even though tabular is an adjective, he hasn't highlighted it. And then one of our researchers mentioned tabular displays a scientific classifier, so it's a different type of adjective compared to marvelous. So there was a meta language here, or a discussion about different types of adjectives. And another researcher mentioned this is a great opportunity for the English teachers to work on types of adjectives which are necessary to provide good definitions. Anyway, so there was a discussion on the results of these tasks that they had designed together. Right, so just to close this presentation, we moved from a focus on language and content integration, combining CDFs, cognitive discourse functions, and systemic functional linguistics, moving to a assessment using a multidisciplinary approach, using comparative judgment, where each teacher assessed using their own criteria, moving then to interdisciplinary work, with this work between content and language pairs. And then the final work was really that where content teachers, language teachers, and researchers discuss the final results from a learner's texts. Okay, I think I'm going a bit over time, so I was just, this is just to show how we connect the different lexicogrammatical features using the SFL framework to the CDFs, and how somehow these also relate to genres. Although, as Anne mentioned, we use the cognitive discourse function unit because it is a, let's say, we found it as a unit that is usually more workable in the context of in the educational context that we analyzed, in the sense that the students were not really introduced to texts containing stages. Maybe define is the one that could be more related to a genre, but in other cases, they tend to work with more specific types of texts, sort of eliciting shorter responses that may not correspond to a genre or different stages and so on. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here, and well, thanks very much. And we would be very happy to listen to your comments, and or if you have any questions, we're happy to respond to them if we can. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'll turn the floor to Maria. I had the first question in the chat there. Would you like to ask it aloud? Oh, on mute.
I was wondering whether what you presented on MACAP, whether the language of the students changed in the evaluation because of just maturity, or because they encountered text that had those more complex structures.
Yes, probably both. I mean, we can't really answer that question because, again, our idea was to collect the data just from what the students were actually, being taught in the classroom. We work with the teachers on the prompts, okay, but there was no explicit teaching. So, we went in, we wanted to collect data. So the teachers would say, well, we're working on ancient Rome. So the team worked together to create a prompt that would elicit those cognitive discourse functions. It's a great question. It's hard to know what led to the change over the years. I would assume that it is both, that the students are, reading history, they're learning history over the years, but they're also maturing. And, we do find these differences across students, which is interesting because, for example, the data comes from schools where the children are of a similar, middle class background. So, again, I think it is difficult to explain the change over the years in exact terms because there was no intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So probably both.
Thanks.
We have one other question here in the chat from Jennifer Green, also over here in the Pacific Northwest with me. Is the comparative judgment tool free or publicly available? And can you share where folks might find it, if so?
Yes, it is. I mean, we use No More Marking, okay, which is a company that, well, allows you to use it for free, and then they're really happy to give you a tutorial on that. So you can just contact them. If you Google, let me see if I can paste it, but if you Google No More Marking, yes, No More Marking, exactly. And then you can find all the information there, but please feel free to email us if you need any more help. I mean, we are really, we're interested in this tool about 2 years ago, maybe, Anne, wasn't it? And yes. We, at that time, that was before the pandemic. I don't know if things have changed because of that, but we had a free tutorial by one of the, one of the authors of this tool, and they were really kind and so on. So there are other tools out there, but you have to pay, and this was for us really very useful, and it's a tool that is used in the UK for, and it's used by many schools, like involving lots of students. We only used it for a small amount of students, but it can be used broadly, involving many schools and many teachers.
Wonderful. And there's one final comment/question here from Miriam Moore, who says this has been a fascinating talk, and they work within a college setting where they've been asked to develop a new writing across the curriculum, professional development for faculty, which is typically handled from a comp and rhetoric point of view, but they see great value here in adapting some of this comparative judgment stuff and basic SFL meta language for their multi/interdisciplinary discussions, which is to say, would you be willing to share your PowerPoint as they work on that?
Sure. I don't know what the procedure is, if we can send it to you, Catherine, or how is it? I mean, of course we can share it, and we're happy to share it and to share, receive your comments, insights, and discussion. But I don't know what the best way is.
Well, that's like for now, maybe we'll just point out that you've put your emails there in the chat. So Miriam, maybe you can reach out.
Okay, let's do that.
Otherwise,
the sessions are recorded, right? So you can get them in YouTube later.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, they're there, and you already included our emails. Okay, great. Yes, that's the best thing. Just email us, and that's
wonderful. Well, please, everyone, join me in thanking our presenters for this talk. We'll conclude